There's a question that people ask Gregg Braden almost every day, whispered in the quiet corners of conferences, typed into emails that arrive at 3 a.m., asked by souls whose eyes carry that particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from trying so hard to make life work. They ask him, "Gregg, what do you personally do every morning? How do you tune yourself to the field?" And if you've ever felt that same yearning, that deep hunger to understand how someone who has spent decades bridging ancient wisdom and modern science actually lives these principles, then what follows is for you. Because Gregg reveals something profound. Most of us were taught that manifestation is about asking louder, visualizing harder, repeating affirmations until our voices go hoarse. But here's what he's discovered after years of studying the language of the heart, the wisdom encoded in ancient texts, and the cutting-edge discoveries of quantum biology. The field doesn't understand words. It doesn't hear your requests. It feels your frequency. And every single morning, before the world rushes in with its demands and distractions, Gregg does something that transforms his body from a biological machine running on autopilot into what he describes as a transceiver of miracles. This isn't mysticism. This isn't wishful thinking. This is about understanding that you are a technology. And like any technology, you need to be calibrated, tuned, prepared. So let's pull back the curtain and discover exactly what he does when he wakes up and why it works. There's a conversation that Gregg Braden had recently with Dr. James Doty, a neurosurgeon at Stanford, that changed the way he understood everything about manifestation. Doty wasn't speaking as a mystic or a spiritual teacher. He was speaking as a scientist who had spent his entire career mapping the neural pathways of the human brain. And what he told Gregg confirmed what the ancient traditions have whispered for thousands of years. The heart is the master, not the servant. Think about what happens the moment you open your eyes in the morning. Before your feet even touch the floor, your mind is already racing. It's running through the list of things you didn't finish yesterday, the worries about what might go wrong today, the regrets that sit like stones in your chest, the anxious predictions about a future that hasn't even arrived yet. This is what Gregg calls living in survival mode. And when you're in survival mode, your biology is designed for one thing only: to keep you alive, not to create, not to manifest, not to connect with the infinite intelligence of the field. Your nervous system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart rate becomes erratic and chaotic, and the electromagnetic field that your heart generates, which is 5,000 times stronger than the field generated by your brain, becomes incoherent, scrambled, like a radio station filled with static. And here's what Gregg wants you to understand, not just intellectually, but in the very cells of your body. When your heart is incoherent, you are disconnected. You are like a phone trying to make a call with no signal. The field is always there, always listening, always responding. But if your biology is broadcasting chaos, if your heart and your brain are not speaking the same language, then the signal never goes through. Dr. Doty explained to Gregg that the heart contains approximately 40,000 neurons, a network so sophisticated that it operates almost like a second brain. These neurons send more information to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. The heart is not just a pump. It is an organ of perception, an instrument of intelligence, a gateway to what Gregg calls the divine matrix. When your heart is coherent, when the rhythm of your heartbeat becomes smooth and harmonious, something extraordinary happens at the cellular level. Your nervous system shifts from sympathetic dominance, which is the fight or flight response, into parasympathetic activation, which is the state of rest, digest, and heal. Your body releases a cascade of healing chemistry: oxytocin, the hormone of connection and trust; serotonin, the neurotransmitter of well-being; and DHEA, the anti-aging hormone that regenerates your cells and strengthens your immune system. But more than that, when your heart is coherent, the electromagnetic field that it generates expands outward, measurable up to 8 to 10 feet beyond your physical body. And this field, this invisible signature of who you are, begins to interact with the quantum field around you. Gregg often says that the ancients understood this. They didn't have the technology to measure coherence the way we do now with devices like the HeartMath monitor, but they knew that the heart was the seat of wisdom, the portal to the divine, the place where prayer becomes power. They knew that you couldn't think your way into a new reality. You had to feel your way there. And this is where most people get stuck, because we've been conditioned by a culture that worships the mind, that tells us to analyze, strategize, figure it out, control it, force it. But the mind alone cannot create coherence. The mind, when left to its own devices, will always pull you into the past or push you into the future, and neither of those places exist in the quantum field. The only point of power, the only moment where creation happens, is right here, right now. And the only way to anchor yourself in this moment is to move your awareness out of your head and into your heart. This is not a metaphor. This is not poetic language. This is biology. When you breathe deeply and intentionally, when you focus your attention on the area of your heart, when you generate a feeling of gratitude or appreciation or love, you are literally sending a signal to your autonomic nervous system that says, I am safe. I am not in danger. I can stop surviving and start creating. And Gregg has witnessed this transformation, not just in his own life, but in the lives of thousands of people who have learned this practice. He's seen people heal from chronic illnesses that doctors said were incurable. He's seen relationships that were shattered come back together. He's seen financial miracles, creative breakthroughs, synchronicities so precise and so perfectly timed that they could only be described as the universe speaking directly to that person. But none of it happens by accident, and none of it happens by wishful thinking. It happens because these individuals learned to do one thing every single morning before they did anything else. They calibrated their biology. They created coherence. They moved their consciousness from the chaos of the thinking mind into the wisdom of the feeling heart. And in doing so, they became a match for the miracles they were calling in. So when Gregg talks about what he does every morning, he's not talking about a ritual that takes hours or requires you to be a monk in a cave somewhere. He's talking about a simple, scientifically validated practice that takes less time than it takes to scroll through your phone, and yet it has the power to reorganize your entire energetic signature, to transform you from someone who is asking the universe for help into someone who is already living in the answer. So what does Gregg Braden actually do when he wakes up? What is the sequence, the sacred technology that he uses to prepare his biology for the day ahead? He describes it not as a morning routine, but as an activation, a deliberate recalibration of his entire being, and it unfolds in 3 movements, each one building upon the last, each one designed to shift him from the person who went to sleep the night before into the architect of a new reality. And the beauty of what he shares is this: it's simple, it's accessible, and it works because it's rooted in the way your body and the field are already designed to communicate. You don't need special equipment. You don't need years of training. You don't need to be in a perfect state of peace or enlightenment. You just need to be willing to meet yourself where you are and guide your biology into coherence, into that state where miracles stop being rare and start being your natural way of living. The first thing Gregg does, often before he even opens his eyes fully, sometimes while still sitting on the edge of his bed with his feet on the floor, is breathe. But this is not the shallow, unconscious breathing that most of us do throughout the day, the kind of breathing that keeps us just alive enough to function, but never truly awake. This is intentional breath, slow and deep, drawn all the way down into the belly. And with each inhale, he is sending a message to every cell in his body, a signal that says, you are safe. Because here's what Gregg understands about the biology of stress and the biology of creation. When your body believes it is under threat, when your nervous system is locked in that ancient survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah, your biology shuts down everything that isn't essential for immediate survival. Your immune system weakens, your digestive system slows, your capacity for higher thought and intuition and creative problem-solving diminishes, and most importantly, your ability to connect with the quantum field, to send and receive the signals that create synchronicity and manifestation, goes offline. You cannot create from a state of fear. You cannot manifest from a state of lack. You cannot open yourself to miracles when your body is convinced that danger is near. So Gregg breathes, and with each breath, he is consciously activating his parasympathetic nervous system, that branch of the autonomic nervous system that governs rest, healing, regeneration, and connection. He inhales slowly, counting to 5 or 6, feeling his belly expand, feeling his ribs widen, feeling the oxygen flood into his lungs, and then into his bloodstream, and then he exhales even more slowly, counting to 7 or 8, allowing his body to soften, allowing his shoulders to drop, allowing the tension that has been held in his jaw and his neck and his chest to begin to dissolve. And he does this not once or twice, but for several minutes, until he can feel the shift happening, until he can sense that his heart rate is beginning to slow and smooth out, until the chatter in his mind begins to quiet, and the presence of the moment becomes more real than the stories about yesterday or the worries about tomorrow. This is the foundation, the first layer of the practice, and without it, everything else is just words and concepts. Because if your body is still in survival mode, if your nervous system is still flooded with stress hormones, then no amount of positive thinking or visualization or affirmation is going to penetrate the noise. You have to signal safety first. You have to tell your biology that it is okay to stop defending and start creating. Once Gregg has established that rhythm of breath, once he feels his body beginning to relax into a state of coherence, he moves to the second phase, and this is where the magic really begins, because now he's not thinking about what he wants. He's not making a list in his mind of the things he hopes will happen or the problems he needs to solve. Instead, he does something that most people find counterintuitive at first. He reaches back into his memory and he finds a moment, any moment from his life, when he felt pure, uncomplicated joy. It might be a memory from childhood, running through a field with the sun on his face and the wind in his hair, feeling utterly free. It might be the moment he held his newborn child for the first time and felt that overwhelming wave of love and awe. It might be standing at the edge of the ocean at sunrise, watching the light pour over the water and feeling connected to something so much larger than himself. The specific memory doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling it generates. And Gregg focuses on that feeling with his full attention, amplifying it, breathing into it, letting it fill his chest and radiate outward from the center of his heart. And here's why this works. Here's why this isn't just a nice emotional exercise, but a fundamental shift in your energetic signature. The feeling of joy, the feeling of gratitude, the feeling of love. These emotions generate a specific frequency, a measurable electromagnetic pattern that scientists can now detect and record. And this frequency, this coherent wave that your heart produces when you're in a state of elevated emotion, is the language that the quantum field recognizes and responds to. The field doesn't care about your words. It doesn't hear your prayers or your affirmations or your intentions spoken out loud. What it responds to is the signal you are broadcasting, and that signal is determined not by what you think, but by what you feel. So when Gregg generates this feeling of joy, when he holds it in his awareness and breathes life into it, he is essentially tuning his biology to the frequency of the reality he wants to experience. He's not asking for it. He's not hoping for it. He's becoming it. He's embodying the state of being that corresponds to a life of miracle. And the field, which is always neutral, always responsive, begins to organize itself around that signal. Opportunities appear. Conversations happen. People show up. Resources materialize, not because he forced them or chased them or manipulated circumstances, but because his internal state became a match for those external manifestations. Gregg often describes this as living from the end. The ancient mystics called it praying, as if your prayers were already answered. Modern quantum physics calls it collapsing the wave function through observation and intention. But whatever language you use, the principle is the same. You cannot attract what you want by focusing on the lack of it, by feeling the emptiness and the longing and the frustration of not having it. You have to feel as if it's already here, as if the miracle has already happened, as if the healing has already taken place, as if the abundance has already arrived. And the fastest way to access that feeling is not to imagine the details of what you want, but to remember the pure emotional frequency of joy and gratitude, because those emotions are universal. They are timeless. They transcend the specifics of any particular desire. When you feel joy, you are in alignment with the creative force of the universe, and from that alignment, anything becomes possible. And now, with his body in coherence and his heart radiating that field of elevated emotion, Gregg moves into what he calls the third phase of the practice, and this is perhaps the most profound and the most transformative part of what he does each morning. He turns his attention to what he describes as the 10 virtues, a framework that was taught to him by Dr. James Doty. and that aligns perfectly with the teachings found in the wisdom traditions of nearly every culture on Earth. These are not abstract concepts to be understood intellectually. They are states of being to be embodied, frequencies to be lived, and Gregg moves through each one slowly, deliberately, feeling it in his body, breathing it into his cells, allowing it to reshape his consciousness from the inside out. He doesn't rush. He doesn't check them off like items on a list. He lets each virtue settle into him, merge with him, until he is no longer thinking about compassion or dignity or gratitude, but actually becoming them, expressing them through the very field that radiates from his heart. The first is compassion, and Gregg allows himself to feel the deep connection to all beings, to recognize that every person he will encounter today is carrying their own invisible burden, their own secret pain, their own longing for love and acceptance. He feels the desire to ease suffering, not because it's his duty or because it makes him a good person, but because in the unified field there is no separation, and when he holds compassion in his heart, he is acknowledging the truth that your pain is my pain, your healing is my healing. Then he moves to dignity, and he recognizes the inherent sacredness of every human being, the divine spark that lives in each soul regardless of their circumstances, or their choices, or their beliefs. He feels a deep respect for life itself, for the mystery of consciousness, for the courage it takes to be human in a world that so often feels harsh and unforgiving. Next comes equanimity, that unshakable inner peace that does not depend on external conditions, that remains steady and calm, even when the world around him is spinning into chaos. He breathes into the center of his being, and he finds that place within himself that is like the eye of the storm, quiet and still and untouchable by the turbulence outside. Then forgiveness, and this is one of the most powerful frequencies he works with, because Gregg understands that every resentment, every grudge, every story of betrayal or injustice that he holds onto is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Forgiveness is not about condoning what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. Forgiveness is about releasing the chemical signature of the past from his body, about freeing himself from the prison of anger and bitterness so that his energy is available for creation rather than being locked in a loop of reactivity. After forgiveness comes gratitude, and Gregg doesn't wait until something good happens to feel grateful. He feels grateful now, in this moment, for the breath in his lungs, for the beating of his heart, for the mystery of being alive, for the possibility that exists in every new day. He thanks the field for what has already been given and for what is already on its way to him. And in that state of gratitude, he collapses the distance between desire and manifestation, because gratitude is the emotion of having received. Then humility, the recognition that he is not the source of his own power, but a channel for something far greater, a vessel through which the infinite intelligence of the universe flows. He surrenders his need to control, his attachment to outcome, his identification with the small self that believes it has to figure everything out, and he opens himself to guidance, to intuition, to the synchronicities that arise when he gets out of his own way. Next is integrity, the alignment of his inner truth with his outer actions, the commitment to living in a way that honors his deepest values, even when no one is watching, even when it would be easier to compromise. He feels the strength that comes from wholeness, from being undivided, from knowing that his word is his bond, and his life is a reflection of his soul. Then justice, the longing for balance and fairness, not just for himself but for all beings, the vision of a world where resources and opportunities and love are shared, where no one is left behind, where the inherent worth of every life is recognized and protected. After justice comes kindness, the soft power of small gestures and gentle words, the willingness to extend warmth and care to a stranger, to smile at someone who looks lost, to offer help without expecting anything in return. Gregg knows that kindness is not weakness, but a form of courage, a radical act in a world that often rewards hardness and competition. And finally, he arrives at love, the ultimate frequency, the force that binds all of creation together, the energy that flows through every atom and every star and every heartbeat. He doesn't think about love as an emotion directed towards someone else. He feels love as a state of being, a field he inhabits, a frequency he broadcasts simply by existing. And from this place of love, everything else naturally aligns because love is the organizing principle of the universe, the intelligence that knows how to bring order out of chaos, healing out of woundedness, connection out of separation. When Gregg completes this journey through the 10 virtues, something has fundamentally shifted. He is no longer the person who woke up a few minutes ago feeling tired or worried or uncertain. He has become a living embodiment of these frequencies, and his electromagnetic field is now broadcasting a signal that is coherent, elevated, aligned with the highest possibilities available to him. And this is the secret that most people miss when they talk about manifestation or the law of attraction or creating your reality. It's not about what you want, it's about who you are being. Because the field is a mirror, and it reflects back to you not your desires, but your state of being, not your wishes, but your frequency. When you step into your day radiating compassion and gratitude and love, the world has no choice but to meet you there, to organize itself around that signal, to bring you experiences and people and opportunities that match the frequency you are holding. This is not magic. This is not supernatural. This is the physics of consciousness, and Gregg lives it every single day. When Gregg finishes this practice, when he opens his eyes and stands up and begins to move through his day, something profound has happened that most people wouldn't notice from the outside, but that changes everything from the inside. He is no longer operating from the default programming that runs most human lives, that automatic pilot of reactivity and habit and survival-based thinking. He has consciously chosen who he is going to be today. And that choice is not made with his mind, but with his heart. Not with thoughts, but with feelings. Not with words, but with frequencies. And this is where the deepest truth of manifestation reveals itself. The truth that the ancient wisdom keepers understood, and that modern quantum physics is only now beginning to validate. The world you experience is not separate from you, observing you from a distance, waiting to see what you will do. The world is a mirror, a quantum mirror, and it is constantly reflecting back to you the state of consciousness you are holding, the frequency you are broadcasting, the being you have become. Most people approach life as if they are beggars at the doorstep of the universe, asking for scraps, hoping that if they pray hard enough or visualize clearly enough or repeat their affirmations with enough conviction, then maybe, just maybe, something good will come their way. They wake up each morning carrying the weight of yesterday's disappointments and tomorrow's anxieties, and they wonder why their circumstances never seem to change, why the same patterns keep repeating, why the miracles they read about in books or hear about in stories never seem to happen to them. And the answer that Gregg has discovered through decades of research and personal practice, is heartbreakingly simple. You cannot receive what you are not in vibrational alignment with. The field does not give you what you want. The field gives you what you are. If you wake up feeling lack, you will create more experiences of lack. If you wake up feeling fear, you will attract more situations that validate that fear. If you wake up disconnected from your heart, living entirely in the survival mechanisms of your primitive brain, then the universe has no choice but to deliver a reality that matches that frequency, a reality of struggle and scarcity and separation. But when you do what Gregg does, when you take those first precious moments of your day and you deliberately shift your biology out of survival and into creation, when you generate coherence between your heart and your brain, when you feel gratitude before you have a reason to be grateful, when you embody love before someone has earned your love, when you radiate compassion and dignity and equanimity, not as responses to external conditions, but as choices that arise from the deepest part of your being, then everything changes. Not because you have manipulated the universe into giving you what you want, but because you have become a different person, operating at a different frequency. And the mirror of reality has no choice but to reflect that new frequency back to you. The synchronicities start to happen. The phone rings at exactly the right moment. The person you needed to meet shows up in the most unexpected place. The solution to a problem that has been plaguing you for months suddenly becomes obvious. The resources you need arrive just in time. And people who witness these events in your life might call them coincidences or luck or good fortune. But you will know differently. You will know that you have learned to speak the language of the field, and the field is speaking back. Gregg often tells the story of a woman who came to one of his workshops years ago. A woman who was battling a chronic illness that had been diagnosed as incurable, who had tried every medical treatment available and found no relief, who was living in constant pain and had resigned herself to a life of limitation and suffering. She learned this practice, this simple morning ritual of breath and feeling and virtue, and she committed to it with a kind of fierce devotion, not because she believed it would heal her, but because she had nothing left to lose. And within 3 months, her symptoms began to diminish. Within 6 months, her doctors were baffled because the markers they had been tracking, the indicators of disease progression, had not only stopped advancing but had started to reverse. Within a year, she was symptom-free, and when they ran the tests again, they could find no trace of the illness that had once defined her entire existence. The doctors called it spontaneous remission, a mysterious anomaly that medicine cannot explain. But this woman knew what had happened. She had stopped being the person who was sick. She had stopped identifying with the diagnosis, stopped feeding the fear and the victimhood and the story of limitation. Every morning she woke up and she generated the feeling of wellness, the frequency of vitality, the state of being that corresponded to a healthy body, and she did it with such consistency and such emotional intensity that her biology had no choice but to reorganize itself a new signal. And this is not an isolated case. Gregg has witnessed this same principle at work in every area of human experience. He has seen people transform their relationships by embodying the frequency of love and connection before their partner changed a single behavior. He has seen people manifest financial abundance by living in gratitude and generosity, even when their bank account was empty. He has seen creative breakthroughs, career transformations, profound shifts in life direction, all because someone learned to stop waiting for the external world to change and started changing the only thing they truly have control over, which is their internal state, their frequency, their way of being. Because here is the secret that cuts through all the confusion and all the conflicting teachings about manifestation. You are not trying to get the universe to give you something. You are learning to become the kind of person to whom those things naturally flow. You are not asking for miracles. You are becoming a miracle, a walking embodiment of coherence and elevated emotion and conscious intention, and the quantum field, which is infinitely intelligent and infinitely responsive, cannot help but reorganize itself around that signal. Gregg says that when he walks through his day after completing this morning practice, he feels like he is moving through a living dream, where the boundaries between inner and outer reality have become permeable, where his thoughts and feelings seem to take form in the world around him with startling speed and precision. And he is careful to emphasize that this is not about controlling reality or bending the universe to your will or using spiritual techniques to get what your ego wants. This is about aligning yourself with the flow of creation, with the intelligence that animates all of life, with the force that the mystics have called God and the scientists have called the unified field, and that Gregg calls the divine matrix. When you are in alignment, life stops being a struggle. Doors open that you didn't even know existed. People offer help without being asked. Solutions appear in ways you could never have engineered with your thinking mind. And you begin to understand that you were never separate from this intelligence, never disconnected from this flow, never abandoned by this loving presence. You were just broadcasting the wrong signal, living in the wrong frequency, identified with a version of yourself that was small and scared and convinced that survival was the only option. But now you know differently. Now you understand that every morning you have a choice. You can wake up and immediately surrender to the momentum of yesterday, letting your mind drag you into the past or push you into the future, letting your body run on the chemistry of stress and fear, letting your heart remain chaotic and incoherent. Or you can do what Gregg does. You can take a few minutes, just a few precious minutes before the world demands your attention, and you can breathe yourself into safety, feel yourself into joy, embody the virtues that represent the highest expression of what it means to be human. And in doing so, you can step into your day as a completely different person, a person who is no longer asking for miracles, but living as one. And when you do this consistently, when you make it a practice rather than an occasional experiment, you will discover what Gregg has discovered, what the ancient masters knew, what quantum physics is now proving, that reality is not fixed, circumstances are not permanent, And you are far more powerful than you have ever been taught to believe. You are not a victim of your biology or your past or your circumstances. You are the architect of your experience, the artist of your life, the co-creator with an intelligence so vast and so loving that it has been waiting patiently and endlessly for you to remember who you truly are and to step into the fullness of that truth. So here we are at the end of this conversation, and yet perhaps at the beginning of something far more important, something that cannot be measured in minutes or words, but only in the quality of your life, in the depth of your peace, in the frequency of the miracles that begin to appear when you align yourself with the way creation actually works. Gregg Braden has spent decades traveling the world, studying ancient texts in monasteries and temples, collaborating with scientists at the frontiers of quantum biology and neuroscience, all in service of answering one fundamental question: how do we bridge the gap between the spiritual wisdom that has been passed down through generations and the practical reality of living a human life in this modern world? And what he has discovered, what he practices every single morning without fail, is not a complicated system that requires years of training or special abilities or access to hidden knowledge. It is a simple, elegant practice that takes less time than most people spend scrolling through their phones before they even get out of bed. And yet, it has the power to fundamentally reorganize your biology, your consciousness, and your relationship with the field of infinite possibilities that surrounds you. But here is what Gregg would want you to understand, and this is perhaps the most important thing he could share. Knowing this information changes nothing. Understanding the science of coherence, appreciating the beauty of the 10 virtues, nodding along as you listen to these, none of that creates transformation. Transformation happens only when knowledge becomes practice, when understanding becomes embodiment, when inspiration becomes action. You can read every book ever written about manifestation and the quantum field and the power of the heart. You can listen to every talk and watch every video and study every ancient text. But if you do not actually do the practice, if you do not sit down tomorrow morning and breathe yourself into coherence and generate the feeling of gratitude and embody the virtues that represent your highest self, then nothing will change. Your life will continue along the same trajectory, driven by the same unconscious patterns, creating the same results. And you will wonder why the teachings that seem to work for other people never seem to work for you. So Gregg extends an invitation, not as a guru standing above you, but as a fellow traveler on this mysterious journey of being human, someone who has stumbled and struggled and doubted just like you have, someone who has learned these truths not through perfection, but through practice, through showing up day after day, even when he didn't feel like it, even when the results weren't immediately visible, even when his mind tried to convince him that it was all just wishful thinking. He invites you to test this technology, not to believe him or to have faith in some abstract concept, but to become your own scientist, your own researcher, your own living laboratory. Tomorrow morning, before you check your messages or turn on the news or let the momentum of the day sweep you away, sit on the edge of your bed or in a quiet corner of your home and breathe. Breathe slowly and deeply until you feel your nervous system begin to shift, until you sense that subtle change from tension to ease, from chaos to coherence. And then reach into your memory and find a moment of pure joy. Amplify that feeling. Let it fill your chest and radiate outward. And while you are in that elevated emotional state, move through the 10 virtues, not as a checklist, but as a sacred journey through the frequencies that define what it means to be fully human, fully alive, fully aligned with the creative intelligence of the universe. Do this for 7 days, just 7 days. Not because 7 is a magic number, but because 7 days is long enough to move past the initial novelty and the resistance that your old patterns will inevitably throw up, and long enough to begin noticing the subtle shifts, the small synchronicities, the moments when life seems to respond to you in ways that feel almost too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Notice what happens in your relationships. Notice what happens in your work. Notice what happens in your body, in your mood, in the quality of your thoughts. Notice whether opportunities begin to appear, whether conversations take unexpected turns, whether solutions present themselves in ways you could never have orchestrated with your thinking mind. And if after 7 days you find that nothing has changed, if your life looks exactly the same and feels exactly the same, then you are free to dismiss this practice and move on. But Gregg would be willing to bet, based on thousands of testimonials from people all over the world who have done exactly what he is suggesting, that you will not want to stop, that you will have tasted something so real and so powerful that going back to the old way of living, the unconscious way, the survival-based way, will no longer be an option. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to understand the full scientific framework that supports this practice, if you want to learn about the research that Dr. James Doty and others have conducted on compassion and coherence, and the neuroscience of transformation, then seek out that work, read those books, watch those lectures. Gregg always points people toward the sources, toward the scientists and the mystics and the researchers who have dedicated their lives to understanding these principles, because this is not about following one teacher or one method. This is about reclaiming your own authority, your own connection to the field, your own ability to create a life that reflects the deepest truth of who you are. The tools are available, the knowledge is accessible, the practice is simple. What is required now is not more information but commitment, not more understanding but courage, the courage to show up for yourself every single morning and choose coherence over chaos, presence over distraction, elevated emotion over survival-based reactivity. Gregg often says that the greatest tragedy he witnesses in his work is not that people don't have access to these teachings, because we live in an age where information flows freely and ancient wisdom is available at the click of a button. The tragedy is that people know these truths intellectually but never live them practically, that they understand the principles but never embody the practice, that they are inspired for a moment but then return to the same patterns, the same frequencies, the same versions of themselves that created the reality they are trying to escape. And he understands why this happens, because he has lived through it himself, because the pull of the familiar is incredibly strong, because the ego will do everything in its power to convince you that change is too hard, or too time-consuming, or too uncertain. But what if the opposite is true? What if the hardest thing you could possibly do is continue living the way you have been living, continue waking up to the same worries and the same limitations, and the same sense that there must be more to life than this? What if the most uncertain path is the one where you keep waiting for the external world to change before you allow yourself to feel joy, or gratitude, or love? What if the practice that seems like it requires effort in the beginning becomes the most effortless, most natural, most essential part of your day once you have experienced the transformation it creates? So the question is not whether this practice works, because the science is clear and the testimonials are abundant, and Gregg himself is living proof that a human being can learn to operate at a frequency that magnetizes miracles. The question is whether you are ready, whether you are willing, whether you will choose, starting tomorrow morning, to become the person who does not ask the universe for a better life, but becomes the frequency that a better life naturally flows toward. Because the field is waiting. It has always been waiting. It is not withholding anything from you. It is not judging you or testing you or making you prove your worthiness. It is simply responding, always and forever, to the signal you are broadcasting. And the moment you change that signal, the moment you shift from survival to creation, from fear to love, from incoherence to coherence, the field responds instantaneously, reorganizing reality around your new frequency. This is not a promise. This is not a belief system. This is the way consciousness and matter interact, the way the quantum world operates, the way the divine matrix has always worked, long before we had the technology to measure it or the language to describe it. And so Gregg's final words, the closing of this invitation, are not filled with hype or pressure or demands. They are soft, almost whispered, like a reminder from a wise friend who knows that you already have everything you need within you. He would say, "You are the architect. You have always been the architect. Your biology is the instrument. Your heart is the transmitter. Your coherence is the key. And the field is listening, always listening, waiting for you to speak the language it understands, which is not the language of words, but the language of feeling, not the language of asking, but the language of becoming." So tomorrow morning, when you open your eyes and the world begins to pull at you with its urgency and its noise and its endless demands, remember that you have a choice. Remember that there is a practice, simple and profound, that can change everything. And remember that the person you become in those first few minutes of your day will determine the reality you experience for all the hours that follow. The field is a mirror. What will you show it? Who will you choose to be? The answer, as it always has been, lives in your heart, and it is waiting for you to listen.